8. The birthplace of biological warfare. Straddling the border between modern-day Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, the Aral Sea was once the world's fourth largest lake. It began shrinking during the 1960s due to a Soviet irrigation project that diverted the rivers that fed it. All that's left of the sea today are a handful of small lakes. Before this started happening, the Aral Sea was home to a 77-square-mile island called Vozrovdenaya. In 1948, the Soviets built a top-secret biological weapons facility on the island along with the staff housing nearby. It was known as Aralsk 7, and it functioned as an experimental lab and testing ground for numerous extremely hazardous biological agents, including anthrax, smallpox, plague, brucellosis, and tularemia. In other words, it's where scientists weaponized highly contagious and deadly diseases. Putting such a dangerous place on a remote island still wasn't enough to protect civilians from the potentially fatal effects of their experiments. It's unclear whether the Soviets realized this or not. But this lesson became clear in 1971 when the facility accidentally released smallpox into the environment, infecting 10 people and killing 3 of them. Around 50,000 of the region's residents were inoculated in a mass vaccination following the incident, which was kept largely hidden from the rest of the world until 2002. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, Aralsk 7 was abandoned and its 1,500 residents, all government employees, were relocated. Buildings, vehicles, furniture, equipment, and Soviet-themed relics, including artwork and uniform buttons, offer a glimpse into the lives of the staff members who once lived and worked on the island. But the toxic and life-threatening materials they experimented with were also left behind. Authorities failed to store and dispose of them properly, making it dangerous for anyone to visit. Many of the containers that were used to store the biohazardous agents have sprung leaks, posing major hazards to the surrounding environment and nearby residents. After being called out internationally in recent years due to lack of action, the Russian government has stepped up its efforts to make the area safe again. So far, 10 anthrax burial sites have been decontaminated as part of an ongoing effort to clean up the site. 7. Sary shagun. In 1956, Soviet officials approved plans for the construction of an anti-ballistic missile testing facility along Lake Balkhash in southeastern Kazakhstan. Known as Sary shagun, the sprawling 31,350 square mile site hosted its first missile launch in 1958, but it wasn't prepared for full-scale testing until 3 years later, in 1961. A closed city was built nearby for its workers. Sary shagun was the first and only facility of its kind in Eurasia. It was chosen for its remoteness, typically clear skies, and lack of valuable farmland, which made the property an ideal choice for the development and testing of nuclear weapons. During its years of operation, the Soviets designed and tested dozens of weapons and equipment systems, including anti-missile systems, anti-aircraft missile systems, guided missiles, radar systems, laser weapons, and more. After the Soviet Union fell in 1991, leaders of newly independent Kazakhstan agreed to lease a portion of Sary shagun's testing ground to Russia. It's the only part of the site that's still being actively used. The rest of the property is designated for Kazakhstan's use, but nothing has been done with it since it was decommissioned during the 90s. Anyone who wants to visit the neglected part of the site can easily just go there. Unlike many former Soviet facilities, there are no signs marking its boundaries or warning trespassers to stay out. In 2005, the closed city nearby that once housed staff members and their families became open to the public. The deserted buildings at Sary shagun are visibly losing their battles against time, nature, and neglect, and locals have thoroughly picked the site over for scrap metal and building materials. They do so at the risk of coming into contact with dangerous materials that have been left behind, which happened on at least one occasion when civilians discovered barrels full of napalm. 6. The Stay Behind Cave. For decades following World War II, there were rumors of a secret chamber inside the Rock of Gibraltar. It's situated somewhere along a complex of tunnels that the British built within the rock during the conflict. These dark, narrow pathways occupied nearly 30 miles of space and housed a hospital, soldiers' barracks, and storage space for guns and ammunition. But the secret chamber's existence remained unproven until relatively recently. Known as the Stay-Behind Cave, the 45 by 16 by 8 foot enclosure was the designated site of a top-secret plot called Operation Tracer. The British built it after learning about Hitler's plan to invade Gibraltar. Operation Tracer called for a surveillance team of 6 men to remain sealed inside the Stay-Behind Cave with enough supplies to last them for a year, including 10,000 gallons of water. They would observe the harbor through 2 small openings. The chamber was equipped with a radio room, power generators, and other necessities. If the men died in the Stay-Behind Cave, it would become their tomb. They'd only ever escape if the Allies defeated Germany before their provisions ran out. The 6 recruits began their training, but the mission was called off as Hitler's priorities shifted elsewhere. The equipment was removed from the room and the area leading up to it was sealed off. Rumors long circulated about the secret chamber, but the government kept its existence a secret from the public. In the meantime, civilians spent years searching for it. They finally found it in December 1996. One of the veterans who was recruited to participate in Operation Tracer confirmed that it was the Stay-Behind Cave. The room contained cork flooring that was meant to provide noise insulation. In a far corner, there was a sink that drew water from the 10,000-gallon tank. A corridor connected the chamber to the radio shack and a small bathroom with 2 toilets, and there was a set of stairs leading to an observation post. It's hard to imagine being cooped up in the dreary complex for an entire year, and it's probably a good thing that it was never put to use. Would you live in the Stay-Behind Cave for 1 year for $2 million? Tell us in the comments and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. 5. Kansas City Workhouse. There's a medieval-looking castle nestled in a historic section of Kansas City, Missouri. You can tell just by looking at it that it hasn't been used in a while. Windows are boarded up and parts of the neglected structure are covered in graffiti. But it's not quite as old as it looks. Built in 1897, it once functioned as a prison called the Kansas City Workhouse. The jail itself was constructed by inmates who mined its limestone building blocks from the ground. Many of the prisoners who spent time at the workhouse were petty criminals, including panhandlers and drunks, who came to Missouri to drink at a time when alcohol was outlawed across the river in Kansas. The castle stopped operating as a prison in 1924. It was repurposed around a dozen times over the next 50 years before it was finally abandoned for good during the 70s. Since then, various ideas have been put forth for how to bring it back to life. At one point, there were plans to turn it into a community center, but nothing's been done with it yet. The workhouse continues to fall further into disrepair as it sits unused along a city street. 4. Greenhome Textile Factory. Situated along the banks of the Narva River, just 10 miles from the Baltic Sea, the island of Greenhome straddles the border between Estonia and Russia. In 1857, it became the home of the Greenhome Manufacturing Company. Founded by German businessman Ludwig Knupp, its cotton spinning and manufacturing mills were once the world's largest, and it was considered Russia's most important mill. At its peak, the Greenhome Manufacturing Company occupied a 32,000-acre property and employed around 12,000 workers, who were provided with affordable housing, a hospital, 2 churches, and schooling for their children. It may sound like the employees had it good, but the factory encountered numerous obstacles over the years. 420 employees lost their lives during a cholera epidemic in 1872. The following year, workers rebelled against the low wages and substandard conditions at Greenhome in what went down in history as Estonia's first industrial strike. It erupted into a full-blown riot, and authorities were called in to suppress the chaos. After World War I, the company experienced a crisis due to a decreasing demand for cloth, resulting in the mill's partial closure and nearly causing its doors to shut permanently. But it survived and saw a revival, and continued operating into the 2000s when it began to struggle again. In 2010, the company went bankrupt. Operations have continued in a limited capacity under new ownership, but for the most part the facility remains abandoned. The English-style red brick buildings still stand today. Although they were used into modern times, they serve as a reminder of an era that preceded the workers' rights and protections that exist under today's labor laws. 3. Zeldtini Missile Base. Deep in the woods of northeastern Latvia, near the Russian and Estonian borders, there's a collection of buildings that once functioned as a Soviet missile base. Located over 15 miles from the nearest town, the once top-secret site, known as Zeldtini, was deliberately built in the middle of nowhere. Established in 1962, Zeldtini was one of just a handful of bases in the Baltic region that were capable of housing ballistic missiles. It went into operation shortly before the Cuban Missile Crisis, which only increased the site's importance as Cold War tensions between the US and the Soviet Union hit an all-time high. At its peak, the base was home to around 300 military personnel who were tasked with guarding at least 4 nuclear missiles, although some sources say they guarded as many as 8. The weapons were stored in underground silos where they sat ready to be launched at any time in case the need arose. Thankfully, that never happened, and the facility was decommissioned in the late 1980s after Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to dismantle immediate and short-range missiles in both the US and the Soviet Union. Today, the abandoned site consists of aging, hollowed-out buildings that are covered in graffiti and starting to fall apart. Once kept a total secret from the public, it's now a popular destination for off-the-beaten-path explorers. Those who look closely will notice distinct remnants of the Soviet era, including a 10-foot sculpture of Vladimir Lenin's head. Zeldtini is the only surviving nuclear missile base out of the 3 that once existed in the region, serving as a chilling reminder that at one point not too long ago, the Latvian woods contained enough weapons of mass destruction to wipe out a large portion of the planet. It takes planning and effort to reach the site, but those who've been there say it's well worth it. Apparently, there's also a lot to see at the former base as well. One visitor who recounted his experience in the travel blog Kathmandu and Beyond wrote that he spent around 2.5 hours exploring and taking photos and praised Zeldtini as one of the highlights of his travels in the Baltic states. 2. Bayzensai. During the Soviet era, Bayzensai was a bustling mining town filled with high-paid workers, nice shops, top-of-the-line recreational facilities, and a much higher standard of living than most towns offered in the region. It even had its own airport. Located among the Karatau Mountains in southern Kazakhstan, the town was centered around polymetal ore operations that offered some of the region's most competitive salaries. Bayzensai was established during the early 1940s amid a heightened demand for lead. The metal ore was shipped to a plant about 90 miles away, where it was made into bullets. Legend has it that 1 out of every 7 bullets fired during World War II was made with lead harvested from the town's mines. During its heyday, Bayzensai enjoyed both a profitable economy and subsidized support from Moscow. And that all began to change during the 1970s as the lead deposits grew scarce and the local mining industry began to decline. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union's collapse officially brought decades of production to a screeching halt. Like many other towns that were centered around a specific industry, Bayzensai emptied out as former mine workers sought new opportunities elsewhere. Schools, public baths, stores, homes, administrative buildings, and churches were left to decay and are almost completely destroyed now. But the crumbling remnants of some structures remain, including a 1950s-era graffiti-covered welcome sign that once greeted people as they drove into the ultra-modern town. There are also several deteriorating stone buildings, a mosque, and the massive entrance to the former mine, which has become flooded since its abandonment. The dilapidated ruins of the seemingly post-apocalyptic settlement stands as an eerie reminder of the Soviet Union's failures and the rapid decline leading up to its fall. While Bayzensai no longer officially exists, several families are rumored to still spend their summers there. 1. Premcell Fortress. Between the mid-19th century and the beginning of World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire built a series of fortresses outside the city of Premcell in southeastern Poland. During the First World War, it saw extensive combat among soldiers from numerous militaries, including Austrians, Hungarians, Russians, Germans, Czechs, Poles, and Italians. The complex was heavily fortified and equipped to survive a prolonged siege. It consisted of a central fortress, 25 smaller forts, and 12 artillery structures. In September of 1914, the Russians attacked the fortress. Within 10 days, they blocked it off completely. The months-long siege ended in March of 1915 when the Austro-Hungarians surrendered to the Russians, who repurposed the fortress for their own use. Just weeks later, the Germans captured it. They made some minor repairs, but by then the fortress was heavily damaged and no longer of military significance. It saw very limited use after that, but has remained largely abandoned since then. The complex ruins still stand today and are a designated heritage site. Over the years, many of the buildings have become overgrown and have started to blend in with the landscape. Their modern appearance is a stark contrast to how they once stood out against their natural surroundings and dominated the landscape as Europe's largest defensive fortress. Thanks for watching. Would you like to visit any of these creepy abandoned places? Let us know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.